Hey, my name's Kyle from 13 & Company. And some of you guys may have seen my stuff on Instagram or Pipeburn or Bike Effects. But if you haven't, check the links in the description. All my stuff's down there. Go ahead, give me a follow. And if you like my stuff, I appreciate it. Thank you. Today I wanted to talk about my latest build, Amber 2, and some of the things that I did on that bike. If you're interested in that, stick around and let's get to it. So the first thing I'm gonna go over is the most asked question that I get, which is where do I hide the battery? I personally like to use the anti-gravity 8-cell lithium. Tiny little battery, it weighs nothing, and it's great. I've used it on most of my bikes and haven't had any issues. I will say with a smaller battery of that size, you do get less attempts at starting the bike, so you need to make sure that the thing's running pretty good. Now, where I actually physically put the battery is in between the center stand on most CBs. Basically what I do is make an 18 gauge sheet metal battery box, and I 3D print a little cartridge that the battery can sit inside so that it doesn't move around. But for someone that doesn't have a 3D printer, you can totally use the foam that's provided with the anti-gravity battery to kind of take up the play. As far as mounting goes, I machine my own little spacers that have shoulders on them, and they'll actually slide through the holes in the center stand where the center stand axle goes and bolt up to a bolt that's on the battery box. I found that it hides the battery pretty well, and it keeps it away from any of the exposed areas on the bike that you want to keep streamlined. I know some people put them under the seat, but in that case, you're gonna have to have a seat that's tall enough to fit the battery in there, and for me, most of my seats are pretty low profile, so that's just not an option. So moving on to the chassis and the stance of the bike. On Amber 2 in particular, the bike was lowered 3 inches in the front. And if you don't know how to lower suspension, there's a bunch of YouTube videos that will show you how to do that. As far as the frame goes, I cut off the back of the frame and welded in a new subframe loop. In particular, Amber 2 had a machined out rear taillight section, and that meant that the taillight would sit inside of the rear loop instead of on the outside. It just is more aesthetically pleasing, I think, and definitely gives it more of a custom feel. However, all that is 1 1/8 round bar that's hollow. So when you machine it out, there's a big gap that you need to fill to put the taillight in there. For me, what I do is I just make a little inset out of some sheet metal. I bring the taillight up to the edge of the loop so that it's flush. But that's something that you can do if you really have the tools to do it. But if not, and you need to put it on the outside of the tube, that's cool too. The rear shocks are stock repop shocks, and I kind of get away with running a super minimal gap in between the tire and the rear loop. Now, people have said, doesn't it bottom out? And yeah, it totally can. It can bottom out if you hit a bump hard enough, but this bike is not necessarily made for that, and the customer who bought it understands that. The frame itself, detabbed of any tabs that I'm not going to use, or if it's a stock tab and I want to replace it with a better looking aftermarket tab, then that's what I'll do. So I'll take a cutoff wheel, cut off all the unnecessary tabs, take a flap disc and sand it out so that it's smooth. Just be careful. You can take too much metal away easily, and then when you go to paint it, you'll see the ripples in the frame, and that doesn't look good. So just be aware of that and try to go slow if it's your first time doing it, but you can pretty much clean the frame up so that it's very minimal and you have all of the necessary mounting points that you need, or if you need to weld them on, you got a clean slate to start with. So moving on to the seat. Basically a seat will start out just like this. It's a good starting point, but it doesn't get it all the way there. Obviously it's a flat profile when I cut it out. It takes about a couple hours of rolling on the English wheel to start to see the shape come to life. You can roll it as much as you want, but at the end of the day, you're probably gonna need a shrinker and a stretcher. Those tools, basically what they do is a shrinker will push metal together and a stretcher will pull it apart. So essentially making the thickness of the metal either thicker or thinner. So when you're bending a flat piece of metal and you get to the sides here, at some point in that radius, you're gonna have to either shrink or stretch to get your dome-like shape. And it takes practice, but if I can do it and literally learn from YouTube videos, I think you can do it too. It's just a matter of having the tools. And if it's something that you're thinking about taking on, then I would definitely try it, because it's super rewarding at the end of the day when you finish a product and you put it on the bike and it looks good. Seat material itself is actually Italian leather. Now there is a trade-off with any type of real leather. In the sun, you will get some fading. I personally put a protective UV coating on the leather. If you're gonna use this bike as a daily rider, I would definitely switch to a vinyl or some type of seat material that you can pretty much hammer and get away with. I don't sew it in-house. I bring it to an upholsterer, and I'll tell him the initial pattern and how I want things stitched, but he's the guy behind the sewing machine pushing it through. And it's just a little bit too much for me to take on, and one day I will get there, but if you have a professional in your area, I would definitely recommend it, because there's nothing worse than a poor sewn seat. Moving on to the gas tank. The gas tank is actually not the original gas tank that was on this bike. It was a gas tank with the fuel cap cover, and we ended up finding another 1975 CB550 tank that was pristine, and that's because chrome will show everything. And so when I knew that it was going to be chromed, I was scouring eBay or Craigslist or whatever, and I eventually found one on eBay. We paid a pretty good price for it, but the fact that it was going to be chrome, it was well worth it. Now, the process of chroming, if you don't know, first they'll start with a copper plate, and they'll lay a base layer of copper on it, and then they polish any imperfections out, and then they dip it in a tank and do the same process with the chrome plating. In this situation, the tank is filled with air, and so trying to hold a tank in a chrome plating tank is like trying to keep a balloon underwater. It's tough, and so the chromer had an extremely difficult time chrome plating it, and it actually took a couple of attempts before it was perfect. It's probably something that I'm not going to do again because it was such a nightmare, but if you can get it done right, it's absolutely beautiful. It really adds some character to the bike. Another important part of a custom motorcycle is your controls. And what I mean by controls is basically what you're staring down at as you're riding. That's the first thing that the customer notices when he's on it. What I found is that I can take a stock upper triple clamp and rework it in a way so that it looks appealing and unique. Now, what I mean by reworking it is cutting off the OEM bar mounts, and what that leaves on these cast aluminum triple clamps is basically 4 holes where the bar mounts used to be, and you can kind of shape them and make them look symmetrical, and then polish the whole thing over so that it looks like a custom clamp. I've continued to run those on most of my bikes, and it's a lot of work, but I think it's well worth it, considering that you can do all the work in your garage with a hacksaw and a flap disc and a polishing wheel. So onto the engine. I get a lot of questions on how I get my engine so spotless clean. And basically I came across a process a couple years ago called vapor blasting. If you haven't heard of vapor blasting, basically what it is it's wet sandblasting, but instead of a sand, they use a silicone, and it's a wet slurry solution. And when you use it on soft aluminum like this, it basically will make the part look brand new. It doesn't change tolerances, it doesn't affect the surface finish or anything like that. And depending on the pressure that you use to blast, you can actually get a polished finish without sanding anything. And so that is my go-to for any old part that needs to be restored, including carburetors. Like vapor blasting, if there's someone local that can do it for you, it's worth every penny. Once I get the vapor blasted parts back, I'll prep them for paint. Your paint's only going to be as good as the surface that you start with, so keep that in mind when you're painting. The best results come from disassembling the engine and masking everything off properly and taking your time and not rushing it, because if you rush it and you got to redo it again, it's a nightmare. As far as the engine itself, it was completely rebuilt, top to bottom, everything gone through, transmission gone through, brand new lower bearings, brand new primary chain, brand new cam chain guides, pistons, valves, valve seats, everything is brand new. And the reason I do that is for reliability. If I'm going to be doing a top end and I'm already that much into the engine, then I'm going into the lower end just to check it out, even if it's running great. Now the headlight, I bought some pretty cool headlight mounts, and the headlight mounts were a little bit too long for me. I don't like too big of a gap between the headlight and the actual steering stem itself. So what I did is I actually machined them down a little bit, re-drilled a hole, and brought the headlight back into the triple clamp a little bit more. The electronics on this bike are completely hidden underneath the seat. Inside the custom electronics box, we have our regulator rectifier, a Moto Gadget M unit. Now, if you haven't used an M unit before, I highly recommend them. It makes wiring a bike completely painless, and you can get away with running a wiring harness that's literally a quarter of the size of the stock harness. It makes an old bike pretty modern, and so I run them on all my bikes, and I don't think I'll probably ever switch to anything else because it's made my life so easy to wire bikes. And I mean, it's a plug and play solution, and for these old bikes, I mean, it's a total upgrade. So that's pretty much Amber 2 in a nutshell. If you guys have any questions, please follow me on my personal Instagram and send me a DM. I'd be more than happy to help you with any of the situations that you're working on right now, or if you have a question about how I did something, feel free to connect with me, and I would be more than happy to help you. If you made it through the end of this video, I really appreciate it. And if this is something that you want me to do more often or weekly, and kind of talk about the bikes that I've done, or you know, do a complete build series on a bike that I'm working on right now, like, let me know. Let me know in the comments, and I would love to do videos every week. Until next time, see ya.